By acknowledging, for those of us who are not part of the indigenous community, land acknowledgements are a way of showing respect and honoring the people whose land we occupy, who we are working on. An acknowledgement that we are trying not to erase the work that individuals have done. And so I want to read a statement that was prepared by GIA in honor of those indigenous people who lived here and worked here before colonization. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope for a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the ancestral lands. We pay respect to the elders and people of this land, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Please join us in uncovering such truth at any and all public events. And so with this acknowledgement and continuing this theme, I want to pass the mic to the co-chair of the committee, C, to take us a little further in this acknowledgement.
Thanks, Celeste. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all on this Zoom call, and I am going to wrap up our acknowledgements with doing a labor acknowledgement. And so I'm going to read this statement. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. And I will turn it back over to Cheryl Lynn.
Thank you, C. I am so honored and thrilled to be able to introduce Justin Laing, the principal of Hillombo LLC, who's going to be presenting today. And I'll kick it right over to you, Justin.
Okay, great. Oh, it's great to see everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. And essentially, I'm just going to kind of share some of the reactions that I had to what the work that was shared. Sherilyn and Celeste and C asked me just to kind of share a few thoughts, and then we can have a conversation about that. Some of what's going to inform what I'm saying is the work that I've been doing with GIA around developing a workshop, and now we're thinking about a community of practice. So I'd love to be able to kind of get some of your reactions to some of what I'll share. It's kind of still in flux and still developing. So looking forward to kind of any reactions you have to it. And it's a nice small group. So we had talked about going into breakout groups. We might be able to stay in this group right here as long as folks feel comfortable. So I'm just going to share my screen and kind of share with you all what some of this thinking was. So the main thing I thought was, there's a lot of different reactions, a lot of different strategies that people had to deal with white supremacy and their arts funding, and some of it dealt with more grants to BIPOC folks, BIPOC folks on advisory boards. Some of this stuff was even high level, like changing the disbursement, the payments, the 5% spending rate, which I thought was great. Hard to change from inside the organization, just because at least in my experience, if you raise that at the foundation I worked at the board level, it'd be like, that'd be daggone near high treason. But I am glad to see it mentioned more often, because I think that really is one of the big things. So what I zeroed in on was this phrase power dynamics. And thinking about the ways in which even that might be a euphemism, and how we might be able to see the extent to which we could make that language more a little even sharper. I sent out this article yesterday with Shell, and I was just curious how many people even had a chance just to look at that. Anybody have any? Yeah. I'm just curious, how anyone like thumbs up, middle, like any reactions to it? Thumbs up, liked it. How many of y'all were already familiar with the idea of the non-reformist reform? And come on, y'all, work with me. Talk to me.
I really just read it right before I joined the Zoom. So.
Okay, so yeah, that's good. I think that's fantastic because it just got to you yesterday, so it's fine. But it relates to this idea that we've been talking around creating experiments and the criteria for experiments that I mentioned. So I'll talk a bit about kind of what we're thinking of this learning community doing and how I kind of reacted to what you had in that context. So we've started, trying to say, okay, is there a difference between maybe a critical race-based anti-racism and a liberal-based anti-racism? And feeling like, the dominant politics that we're in is like this liberal anti-racism. And they have two kind of different conclusions that I think relate to that phrase of power dynamics. So, on one hand, you have this notion, anyone remember, like have some of what that first bill that poses that white institutions will not make concessions to BIPOC people. Anyone remember know the critical race, what that's called in critical race theory? We can do a little critical race practice since everyone's demeaning it all the time. Come on, don't be shy. You have the answer. You can be smart. Celeste pushes back on you. I know if you get too smart, but don't let her. Okay, well then this is Derek Bell, founder of critical race theory from Pittsburgh actually, and he kind of built critical race on this notion of like interest convergence, right? White institutions will not do anything that's not in their own interest, no matter what they say they're doing it for. They're doing it because it's in their own interest. So then ultimately you have to figure out what's going to make it in their own interest, and that results in like dealing with the power disparity. Right. And counterframing is one of the ways that critical race theory works. So it tries to always look at narratives and reshifting narratives. And so those notes I sent back to you on reframing those questions, which I'm going to show you in a second, was an effort just to practice that. And then also to see your reaction to what extent it worked, what extent it didn't work. A liberal anti-racism frame, and I saw something went in the chat. Is there anything that I should respond to? No, we're good. Okay. A liberal anti-racism frame is like, pose it, this is essentially a learning journey. How many of you all will hear in your institution, like, we're on a learning journey, right? We're on a learning journey, which poses the idea, it's a metaphor of, we're at one place, we're all on the same path, we're going to that place, there's one destination, there's one beginning. Maybe some people don't know what they don't know because they're in different places in the journey. It doesn't suggest that actually there could be whole different routes going different places, different interests, people who actually have no intention on going on that journey. It kind of poses as like this kind of like progressive notion of movement this way, right? And anything that the institution doesn't do is due to lack of knowledge. But one of the ways we know whiteness operates is this notion of like feigned ignorance. Right. And so I don't know if you've ever seen this before or if you've ever done this before, but you'll say something to a white person and they'll be like, oh my God, I did not know. Or they'll like, oh my, that's so deep. And you're in another conversation, you watch them do the exact same thing to someone else who poses the exact same comment. And so there's a way in which a liberal anti-racism will always send you back down this learning road and never kind of open up the idea that actually maybe there's counter-political opinions. So ultimately, the notion, it basically all comes down to what you all brought up, this notion of power dynamics. So I totally am on board with that. And then it's being like, but feeling like there could be even more comments about the organizing needed. And curious for you all's thoughts about that, right? And I have a little bit of experience in that, so I'll share some of my experience with that. So I just want to pause and see if anyone has a comment about these two frames of liberal anti-racism versus critical anti-racism. Does that work for you? Make sense? Or something you already use?
I'll chime in and say I have definitely seen this play out time and time again. I think many of us have. But what I will say that I'm kind of interested, what I see is a shift from understanding as, oh, we just need to get more educated, to this is a structural issue. You can educate yourself on your own time, but what we need to do right now is on this column, right? So, which is encouraging. It's, but the very much the kind of infantilized white person who is like, I didn't know, because you didn't have to, but also, you don't have to know what these things. You don't have to know anything about anything you don't want to. That is, live. You are living beautifully in your privilege in that respect. And I will say that seeing this outlined in this way, that I am definitely seeing some organizations I've worked with in the past, as opposed to what I'm doing in my work now with my agency now. So
that's good. That is good. Yeah. And so this relates to the idea of like you had one of your bullets was like self-decolonialization, and maybe kind of just doing your own inventory, like curious how you all kind of, do you think of yourself in these kind of political terms and say like, oh, I'm kind of like central this, or I'm left, or I'm not even on a left-right continuum. I'm part of a different tradition. Does anyone have any of that? Like they kind of like think about the politics of their institution, kind of locate them and kind of describe them, look at their own, and then say like, well, what's the programmatic expression of my politics at my job? Okay. So I want to show, this was the change of the two questions. So it went from going to, how do I dismantle white supremacy in my art grant making? And I just reframe it to in my role as a program officer or program staff, what reforms or practices can I author or further that will help destabilize racial capitalism, i.e. the idea that capitalism has a built-in logic of creating racialized social categories in order to justify its grossly inequitable process of acquiring and then distributing resources. So that's a mouthful, but the idea here is that to switch out racial capitalism for white supremacy. And just curious if anyone has a reaction to that, the pros and cons of that, what you think it gets you, what you think it doesn't get you.
I think this is what I've been trying to do without really being able to like put words to it, because I work for a government institution. So a lot of what I'm doing is specifically about process and how the outcomes from the process, like the citywide processes, disproportionately affect people, and like what little metered steps I can take to really break those up. But we don't have the politicized language, because I don't even know if as a government agency we could talk about the politicized language. That might get us into like, are we somehow advocating or crossing our boundaries of what we're allowed to, I'm missing the word right now from my brain, but you can't actually engage in political work as a staff member. I can't go, yes, lobby, thank you. I can't go lobby anyone. I can't say who I support. Even as a union, it's like I can't talk about the union at work still. There's some division. So I think coming out with my politics is difficult, especially when I have very radicalized politics compared to the director level individuals. But framing it like this, I think, is really helpful. Maybe that's an entryway to the conversation rather than like the political aspect of it, the capitalism aspect of it rather than the political aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, any reaction to anything Ann said?
Yes, I would say, first of all, thank you for saying that. And then the other thing I would add to that is, yeah, definitely as a state employee, I am, well, not just me, but the entire staff is discouraged from saying anything that could be perceived as too political or trying to sway constituents one way or another, politically. I mean, it's when we have to go across the street from our office to the State House to meet with the House and Ways and Means Committee. If we talk about community and giving communities power, it always turns to, well, what kind of power? Are you talking about voting power? Are you talking about, political power? Like it turns into this thing. So we are definitely, as state employees, discouraged from appearing to be too political.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Celeste. Thanks, C.
I like this language as well. I was thinking about depends on what playing field you're on, right? Like at the Pittsburgh Foundation, I can say white supremacist, capitalist race, I can say all of that, and it's accepted. But then when we're in rooms with other foundations that ain't even nowhere near nothing of this, not even the knowledge building part of it, this is actually good language, because when you say white, people feel away. Automatically, and a defense kind of comes up, even though you're saying the same thing. But I think the language is less volatile in certain situations, and so it's just something for me to take when I go into those 17 foundation meetings that we like to have here in Pittsburgh, to encourage the conversation without having people put out their defenses automatically as a Black woman talking about white people.
Right. Yeah. There's definitely a way in which racial, which I think that's another word that's worth unpacking, like what's even in this word race, like what does race actually even mean? Because I think it's actually its own kind of mystified term, because race describes a hierarchy of European people on top. So really, white supremacy is a better name for race than race, because race almost is, and we're going to talk about this in a second, almost mystifies what's actually going on. So there's a way in which I agree with you, Celeste. Racial capitalism, right, even more plainly spoken, might be like white supremacy capitalism, which would get you right back in. Now you're doubly, in it. And then the response being, one thing I wanted to say, actually, though, going back to what you said, Anne, which is something I think that some of these things I wonder, even if we can't do them in text, can we do them in talk? Can we do them in speech in meetings and disrupt the idea? Because one of the things that I was doing an evaluation recently, and I was looking at this guy who does discourse analysis. And what he was looking at was the reproduction of white dominance through text and talk. And so even when we can't get text, we are in charge of our own talk, and then we have to deal with the consequences of that talk. But I think the idea that state government is not speaking a certain politics is definitely what you could say hegemonic, right? It's so normalized that the very political is actually, it's presented as its opposite, the non-political, right? So that's something that you can always look for, is like, okay, how does this system always kind of present its appearance is actually its opposite? The more we talk about racial equity, the more racist we get, kind of this opposite kind of thing that's going on. And the ways in which the more we say we can't be political here, what is actually behind that is that this is working for some faction. And it's hyper political, but presented as neutral. But we know from the experience of it, it isn't, right? So I think one thing is, I'm curious, how many of you all tried different and even have suggestions to each other or to me? How do you all treat talk and text differently? What kinds of concepts do you use in your work and meetings to try to leverage your position to eventually create, because ultimately we're trying to do is create more space right now for BIPOC artists. I mean, I get the ultimate material objective, but how do you all kind of use arguments to create leverage, and how do you treat talk different than text?
While we're waiting for folks to share, I want to circle back. Indira put in the chat earlier. No, that's okay. She put in the chat earlier something about authoring and versus publishing. And Indira, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, but that actually sounds a little bit connected to Justin's question. Talking versus text, or authoring versus publishing. What are the differences there? I don't know if you want to elaborate. Oh, good.
Yeah, I can come in. I think it was really in reference to the way that the beginning of this is framed, which I love, because I think all of us are doing this authoring work, the writing it down for ourselves, trying to understand all of the various entry points to whatever it is that we're trying to address within our organizations, and then that will impact the folks in which we're looking to serve. And then I think the follow-up to that is like this who is in control of the publishing piece, right? If we're using that analogy of a book, right? And so for me, the language around authoring was resonating with me. And then I was like, yeah, and then we get to this, like putting it to practice, this implementation piece, this publishing it piece, because I have found in some of my experiences that like the authoring and even going into what you're uplifting now, Justin, around like the sharing, whether in text or in meetings, sometimes isn't really necessarily the issue. It's like that next that next piece where it actually involves other people that were not either a part of the authorship or a part of that conversation that end up being the people who are empowered to make the decision around what is actually getting quote unquote published, implemented, right? And so I think there was just something hit me with that, which is why I offered that in the chat of like, I think there's also that next piece that has to be uplifted because sometimes it's beyond even just the staff, right? Like when you start thinking about the board and depending on the level, or the type of organization, we talk about some of the challenges or roadblocks and barriers that exist within being within a government agency, right? Like, so all of those different things, I think, also start to play a part of what we're talking about here, and this power play that is really, really coming up, and definitely tied to race and definitely tied to labor. As I think about even what was uplifted in terms of land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meeting, right? So like all of this is interconnected. It's also interconnected to people not wanting to be wrong, right? So like we have to, embrace that part too, I think. Hopefully that wasn't too long, or at least I'm seeing head nodding, so I'm thinking people can follow.
Yes.
But I hope that was all right.
Yeah, no, I think people can follow you. I mean, I know I can. I won't speak for anyone else, but let's go, Sarah and Lauren.
I guess I'm just feeling like sometimes these words can feel really institutional and hard to penetrate or wrap my own head around. Like I'm still trying to figure out what capitalism is. Like I don't mean to sound like an idiot, but that's still something like basic economic frameworks are still like a mystery to me. So I wonder if other people have a similar thing. Like I need a basic foundation of understanding. And are we ultimately talking about fairness and economic justice? Like who has access to resources? So I like where you were going, Justin, about like, is it better to take it away from, I don't know if this is what you're suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, are there other ways we can simply talk about this without having to put words on paper that might feel institutional and hard for everyone to access?
Well, I think it's really important because I feel like what you're getting at is and I'll go back to this word hegemony. What I mean by that is something that is such a dominant way of seeing things that it appears non-political or non-institutional or non-academic. It appears normal, right? The way like that. And I'm actually of the view that we speak a very academic language right now, but it's become so dominant that we don't realize that it's been put out by think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a counter framing, and it feels like that. But this is what I was going back to real quickly about what I think that we have, interesting debates about, because liberal anti-racism uses current frames and works behind the scene for positive outcomes. And I think a great example of that is Obama. Right? Obama, for example, really used dominant frames. And I think that the hope or the idea was that he's behind the scenes working. And we often would say, he's back there doing it, right? But he can't say that. And I think that's a strategy. I personally think that strategy I've seen run into real problems because eventually the logic actually and the words get bound up together. I don't think that sometimes we're able to think differently than we talk. So if we actually keep using dominant language, my thought is that we eventually start thinking in this way. And I really think when you work in a foundation or a funding agency, you have to be really careful of what I've heard this brother from Atlanta with movement builders call movement capture. And that what happens is that we work for these institutions and then we use their language and we imagine that we're using it to our strategic outcome, but we're also getting kind of stuck in the ways in which that institution imagines things. So I think that when you say, I don't know what capitalism is exactly, that's very fair. I feel like you're also describing capitalism's ways of mystifying itself. And that's actually you having a very capitalistic experience because it doesn't explain what it's doing. It's confusing. And that you do understand it. You understand it's confusing. and it doesn't define itself, and it's always morphing. So I would say, actually, you probably know way more than what you think you know, but you'd have to trust that this confusion is actually its intention, as opposed to your lack of study. So that's my 2 cents there. I don't think we might not agree about that. That my thought is that the counterframes create these conflicts, and in the conflicts, I try to create more space for the things I want. So that's my strategy, is this in a meeting, is to slow it down, to be difficult, to create some other kind of thing that might emerge, and that someone else might be like, shit, if we're just going to be throwing out ideas, fuck it then. I'm going to throw in mine since he apparently gets to say whatever. So it's all about your choice, I think. But my thought is someone has to be disruptive. Someone has to create space that interruption is okay. So the end of this thing is about experiments, right? So I want to say a little bit about.
Sorry, I think Alex has this.
Oh, Alex, I'm sorry, Alex, I didn't see you.
Yeah, but I think there was someone before me, Lauren.
Oh, Lauren, sorry. Sorry.
Oh, no worries at all. I just took the icon down. I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this well, but one of the things that is emerging for me is why there is deflection around organizing. And part of why I'm asking that question is because, not from a naive place, but from a this is what I'm observing kind of place.
Yeah.
I actually work within an organization that does very much champion and allow for the doing and the saying and the experimenting and the being willing to do that pretty boldly, whatever that means in this conversation. And that is supported from board down, all levels. There's no problem saying whiteness. There's no problem saying supremacy. There is no problem shifting practice. But which is not to say that it's all working, but just to say that we have availability to try.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of a group conversation I was in recently of national intermediaries, which is what my organization is, and other artist service organizations who are very aware within even funding of the power hierarchy between us and foundations whose resources we are here to move and support on behalf of artists.
Yeah.
And in this conversation, we were all saying, we're trying so much stuff. Here are other things we can try. What are you doing to move that payment along, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But the tenor of it always resulted in, we could do better if funders were on board with us.
Mm-hmm.
Or, the only way that we could actually move the conversation here is if all higher level leadership was in agreement about a moral threshold and how we would all work together in concert to support that. And so rather than the ASOs further organize themselves, the focus only was on, well, we can't do anything until they move. And that's the space that I keep thinking in these conversations where we're wanting to disrupt that there is a power differential there. And also just getting halted altogether from moving. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I have a thought about that. I want to go to Alex, but anyone have a response to Lauren before we go to Alex?
I think a lot of times it's fear-based. Why people don't move in an organizing fashion. And if you make the determination that this is what you're going to do. I remember having a conversation with a bunch of funders not wanting to put a report out. And I'm like, I know this is your paycheck, right? And so it's a little scary for, you to have to, you're not really about that life is really what it boils down to. And I'm not saying you trade your paycheck, but you got to spend a little bit more time figuring out the strategy. You know what I mean? Because I think that's what it is. It's you don't want to lose your job for, because at the bottom line, we got to eat, right? We don't want to be, homeless, right? But the other part about it really comes down to what are we going to do to challenge these systems? And that's where what I said to those funders, and they were all white women, and they were all at the VP level, right? So they wasn't about to go change status quo, and they wasn't about to put out a report that said that they had racist practices, right? Because they don't want to be accountable for that. So, they rather bury it and then, lift clips from the report, right? And because they, I'm only representative of one foundation, I couldn't make them do it, but I could challenge them in their comfort, right? And so I think that's what it is. It's like with each one of us, we have to assess our level of fear in this piece. And then not say you just go, from the window to the wall, like with whatever, right? But you assess the strategy you want to employ to attack it. But you have to check your own fear. All of us do, as we decide how we're going to move through it. Is the first thing I was thinking.
That's cool. Let's go to Alex.
I'm really appreciating this conversation about language, and also thank you for welcoming me into this group, because I know I jumped in as a GIA member like 3/4 of the way through this year. I'm in a little bit of a different context than many of you, it sounds like, because I'm a philanthropy advisor working directly with the ultra high net worth family. And so I'm thinking, Lauren, about your comments, or Celeste, what you were saying about working with family foundations, for example, who have a different power structure. And I'm thinking a lot about the language that, Justin, you're using around organizing and movement capture, because actually sometimes, depending on my goal, I find myself not using the language coming from grantees, because sometimes I'm not actually trying to organize the donor, I'm just trying to free up the money. And so if I can use the right language to move the money, I juggle that a lot. Sometimes I want to bring them into an educational moment or into relationship, and sometimes I want to make sure the money gets moved. And so I think about, for example, to bring it, I'm not sure if this brings it back exactly to BIPOC artists, but there's Ed Whitfield is a leader in like Black reparations and restorative economics who I've met. And he likes to talk about reparations as returning productive capacity to communities from which it's been extracted. And if I can talk with the donors I work with about the productivity and the capacity of communities, even if reparations is a framework we might want to buy into, I mean, I'm not saying it is necessarily, but if it was, right? What's it doing and what's it not doing? Like, it can free up the money even if it's not organizing. And I want to know for myself, when am I organizing and when am I fundraising? Because they're different things,
And I would say they're not different things. Just to get into a little bit, like I think what we're talking about here are the organizing strategies of the capital class. Philanthropy is their organizing strategy. And some of us are trying to counter organize from our positions, right? But I think this is the thing about the ways in which the dominant structure will make itself seem apolitical and normal. And so we imagine that there's political work and then there's just normal work. But there's actually just constantly organizing among different parties with power. And that's the political nature of humanity. And so when you're doing that, I would say what's happening is the funder is also organizing you. They're giving you language. I think sometimes we should be a little bit more aware that the other person is not just like this empty, non-thinking, non-strategic, rich blob. Right? That they may be political. They may have a strategy about what to do with like emerging young people and their politics and how to shape them and get them to maybe think in the best, most useful ways, take the smartest of them from their various sectors, bring them all together, kind of corral them in a certain kind of format, send them back to their communities looking a little bit different. That could be their own strategy. And then you have to be like, okay, to what extent am I willing to participate in that strategy because I recognize my own oppression and We have to figure these things out. But I would say that you're always organizing and you're picking different tactics. But I want to go back to that slide and said the liberal strategy is exactly what you offered, is to not be too concerned with framing and to go ahead and then get and do the work. And I want to say the criticism of that is that ultimately what it does is it doesn't challenge the underlying narrative of the way society is organized. And until that changes, we'll be constantly picking up the pieces. And so we're going to talk about like liberation, revolution. That requires big time narrative shift. And we're all little narrative managers. So what we're talking about a little bit here is like your narrative management, your narrative strategy, and the risk. So I'm going to go to show a couple of things about this experiment thing. But is that clear? And again, I'm going to go. I'm not telling y'all don't talk. I'm saying I'm going to go be messing with my PowerPoint for a second.
Were there other questions that came up while we're talking? Just because we're almost at 15 minutes to the hour, and I just want to, make sure that if Justin, while we have him, can address any questions or concerns or thoughts you might be having come up.
I just have a brief question about what you said, like, can you think different than you speak? And one of the things that my staff and I call ourselves is our translators. We translate between bureaucracy so that our grantees and applicants can understand what the city wants. We're translators, and it made me think about bilingual folks and also code switching and how that's like inherently built into a lot of what we do and requires us to think and speak in multiple languages. So are you talking about thinking and speaking in multiple like moralistic foundations, or like, I just want to push that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the idea of translating is it definitely has its challenges because, as you know, from any person who speaks multiple languages, not all concepts exist in all languages. Some concepts are lost when they go to the new language. So I would say that there's a translation, there's also a changing of meaning and context and concept as well. And so I think that we have to hold those things. I think that for sure, there's going to be some of this changing and modifying and da-da-da. I guess what I'm advocating for is trying to spend a little bit more time fighting these frames and not giving in so quickly with the idea we're being strategic. I think ultimately it's on a case-by-case basis. And like, I used to always say to in the foundation where I worked at, I knew that the frames of Elijah Muhammad were not welcome and they were not going to be welcome. They couldn't even be raised, right? So there is a place where like these frames are not welcome. They will be like, you'll get disbarred for even bringing those frames in. But I think that right, I would say it, but just to make the point, like, let's be honest, y'all not trying to hear all Black people. Don't say you are. There's a whole section of Black people you're not willing to even talk to. If they speak in their frame, if they speak out of their dominant speech. So I think, and I want to spend more time kind of unpacking what you're saying, because I think that there is nuance and there's obviously negotiation, but I think I'm advocating for kind of like a holding the line and kind of digging in, exploring some other kind of framings. But I also don't know enough about the specifics of what you're saying, so I just want to kind of like, maybe we could talk later at a different time or something. I want to go to one other comment, though, the moral threshold, because I think that's important as a concept to see that's a core liberal notion again, right? The idea that things are moved by concepts. Morality is another concept, right? Critical race would go with something different, material determinism. People are not going to be shifted until their material condition changes, which is why Alex is not going to think he can move this gentleman without a material change. But what I want to say is admit that we've lost power. We're not manipulating that person. They're manipulating us as much as we're manipulating them. They're dictating the frame, and they're enforcing their political language upon us, and that's and that there's a trade-off in that. So I think I think the issue that Celeste brought when she said lose your job, that shows you again material determinism. That is guiding your response. Your material condition is actually what's causing your behavior, not your concepts. And that's important, I think, that we at least start to use that. Critical race will offer you that term, interest convergence, material determinism, that can at least be spoken. That can at least be put into a room and say, let's be honest, it's not about the concepts of this board, it's their material position. Because as we all saw, anyone who was working at any moment of any uprisings, 2020, 2016, 2014, 2010, all of a sudden things move like this. Because it's not about concepts. It's about the material, political conditions, and that's what we're operating in. Okay, quickly to this. So this goes to that article, right? And so I wanted to offer you all these as potential criteria for anti-racist reforms. That what you're doing is various reform strategies when you're creating programs. And I want to explain something about why but essentially these are trying to get at this thing that we talked about at the beginning, power dynamics. But what I think we might change that frame to say is what we're facing is the power of a ruling class, racialized white ruling class And that's the power dynamic. Power dynamics, I think, is a euphemism because it doesn't explain the dynamic. It just says one exists. But what is the dynamic? And I think that we could do more in the specific local situations we're in to name them. Maybe it's a Black-white one, a Latin American one. Like what is it? But I think definitely looking at class and race and gender all together and using those terms to help explain the dynamic will be more disruptive. Power dynamic, I think, is a way of actually avoiding the conflict because people will allow you to say a power dynamic because it's so vague. But describe who has power, how they're using power is to actually make visible the power dynamic. And that's where I think tension gets in. But I think the thing that I think that you get from organizing in any kind of category, whether it's street or inside organizations, is you need tension for change. Tension brings attention. And I think there are ways in which we can do more thoughtfully, managing the level of tension, but using tension for attention and for what we want. Because the rumblings is in some ways, I always thought that the foundation might view me as some kind of signal carrier. Like if he acts like this, he must be linked in with some kind of dynamic we're not aware of, because how could he act like unless he was aware of something? Like it becomes a way, I think, of like changing what's acceptable for other people to say. If you say this much, then you can make other grantees actually appear more normal by their own comparison to you. And so I think that's another way that you might create space for people is by taking that heat yourself, using some of these terms the grantees you'd like to support use. It might also be ways of that. So these are various strategies. And I can imagine some of these have your attention more than others. So I want to leave a space for a second if anyone wanted to bring up. These are all ideas around power. Yeah. Well, I'm going to try this then. I'm going to try a couple here that maybe get into this. So this idea about the ruling class ones, constraining them. So race is part and parcel of the development of the white ruling class, and their general lack of accountability is fundamental to racism. So a strategy constraining racializes white ruling classes by expanding decision-making, decentralizing authority, and grant-making processes. And the tactic, part of the community and creating structures that begin to develop an answerability level of accountability while building it to an enforceable level. And here's another example of shared budgeting. Anything that you can do to let people in to see what's going on increases the community's literacy with this institution. And what it survives on is its lack of literacy and its invisibility. And the more which that I think that you can make it visible and attract people to it, it constrains it a little bit. And this isn't really constraining ruling class, in my opinion. It's constraining the staff of ruling classes to some extent, because Celeste shared a story, and I have a similar one of a report getting tabled. And what I would go do differently, if I could, is figure out a better way in which that report was expected by a board, a community board. So you'd have a harder time bearing it. Now, a local intermediary did its own bearing, even with the community board, because people still know the power dynamic that they hold and they don't hold. And so people are still unlikely to leak reports. We don't see many WikiLeaks in the grant-making world, and you really could, right? I mean, what do we know in emails and reports? We know a lot. So I say it to say, I think the idea of making these things, trying to create some kind of boards or anything that makes the thing visible is a little bit of a constraining factor. Of course, it's moderated by what's going on in the larger world. So I want to keep saying what really makes your work possible is what's happening in the world, not like our own brilliance or whatever. And then the second one I want to talk about is because you guys do individual artist grant making, and just to the notice in which that Western canon and European supremacist assumptions are built into it, like the tradition of the individual artist. And where does that tradition come from? In what ways does it work for some? And in what ways does it not work for others? So there's definitely lots of independent artists and all individual artists in all groups. But my experience was I came out of capoeira. It just didn't work for our language and terms. It and I know a bunch of people in the Luke community here, it doesn't work for us. We have a lot of artists and culture makers, but this individual artist is not a concept from our traditions, and it's odd. And we're not institutionalized, and we're kind of locked out because of this kind of like the genius frame. And so I really think that some of the aesthetics of Western culture need to be unpacked when we're creating these grant making programs, because not all cultures use that same logic. So I'll take a pause here. I only have a few more minutes. I wanted to show you one thing on experiments, but I don't want to try to just cram things. Oh, good. Davon raised his hand. We can't hear you.
I was going to speak to the languages and grant making. So this is my first year having a big boy job, and this is my first year rewriting a grant for individual artists.
Yeah.
And what we were talking about before, I think language really, really plays a key role, because for us, for example, we're the Greater Columbus Arts Council, and we have like eligibility requirements. Mm-hmm. And some of those eligibility requirements, not that it's our fault, the requirements are kind of stifled by the environment around us. For one thing, like we require you to be professional artists. One thing is that the word professional is very broad and everyone takes it differently. And we don't have the staff to explain it in different ways for every applicant. But then one thing is like, we think of professionalism as having your artwork seen by the public, which includes like gallery showings, exhibitions. But then when you start looking at those opportunities themselves aren't diversified for subgroups. So it gets really confusing when you start thinking of things outside of it. And I understand like we run from city taxes, so there's a limit to the funds and we have to do things by certain stipulations, but thinking of the rules as we make them outside of just our organization, I think would be a push, because if artists who are like new immigrants, for example, there's no way for us to gauge their professionalism based on our guidelines, because they haven't been here. They probably have language barriers to get into the opportunities around the city to prove their professionalism. But at the end of the day, they're still an artist. Like they still have their art, but because of these rules, we can't consider them for funding. So I think language plays a huge role, but I'm kind of confused as to moving forward. It's like, well, do you provide multiple definitions of ways things are interpreted? Do you provide more resources for people to meet that milestone if you can't have them come in the door ready for that? Because I've gotten to the notion of I don't believe in saying no a lot to artists, which is great that we have cycles. I kind of tell everyone these are 3 chances to get funded instead of, taking a no. But the language itself probably already scares people away. And I'm just learning now through this call that things get lost in languages. I don't know anything. I just got here. But that's something I wouldn't have taken into account, because the way that I speak outside of the organization is very different. The people that are in my peer group understands everything after I've like reiterated it, but they don't understand it just from looking at the guidelines. And then the guidelines are like 20 pages long, and then people alone don't like have the capacity to get through all of that, especially if the language is too academic. And I think academic makes the organization seem more powerful and established because it's color coordinated like that. But at the same time, I guess the question would be like, what is our agenda, to appear as a certain way or to be a certain way? So
yeah, I feel like there's a lot with that. Government's a whole different bag. It's a lot of going on there. But the one thing I'll say in my experience with government funders, and I think this is with all funders, and I had this in one of my comments, which was like, I do feel like sometimes there is still this explaining of the institution, explaining a way of the institution which serves it and doesn't serve people. So I feel like one thing, for example, when you tell someone no, what I would often try to do is let that no just sit there. Maybe they're going to get pissed off and do something. So I think one thing to do is not mollify people. Like if they're mad that the situation doesn't seem fair, don't try to explain it to them. Like, well, we have more opportunities. Let them be mad. Maybe they're going to come firing back. The other thing I was going to say was, and let them. Like one thing I feel like is let people come back firing at the institution, let them come back firing at you. Ultimately, it's for the good. The institution is not really going to do anything with you for oppressing people. They're not, you're okay. You can oppress. Not that you're doing it intentionally. But I feel like this is a broader conversation, what you're talking about. So I'm not giving you a full response. But the one thing I did want to say, I feel like, is I will see people in my experience with like very restrictive agencies, very politically repressive agencies like arts funders, explain and try to make sense of the institution. They would try to like coach me through it, try to make it make sense, mentor me through it, rationalize it, rather than let me be like, this is horrible.
Yeah, I agree, especially with the language of because this is city dollars, as if I'm not a part of the city and everyone I'm capping for is a part of the city.
Yes.
I had to explain that. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm so enthusiastic about everything you just said. You're a city funder, we're a state funder, so I get it. I just got off the phone with another city funder right before this call, and we were having this exact conversation. And the other thing I'm always going back to, as the person who is responsible for a grant, every question I ask, what is the intention behind the question? And if you don't want to talk about, if you're uncomfortable with that answer, it needs to be addressed immediately. Immediately. Like, who does the question serve? So luckily, the person that renovated the grant, even before I got here, was so in tune with that and made some amazing, amazing adjustments that are about respecting the time and the labor of artists, because we should be paying them to do these applications, quite frankly, because we're asking them to perform labor for us.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I could go on. I know we're at time. I could go on about this for I've been talking about this all day. Devon, if you want to chat, I just sent you my email. So much to say.
I agree. Yeah. That's I want to kick it back to you, Shale, and I've enjoyed talking with you all. There's even so much more we could keep going. I know for a while. I've really appreciated the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. This was so rich, and it feels like too short, but it always feels that way. So I don't really know what to do about it, but I'm glad that we were able to have this time to spend together. Thank you so much, Justin, for putting the presentation together, coming in and leading us through this conversation. And I'm seeing all of the feedback in the chat that folks were definitely nourished.
Can we get the deck? Can we get your slides, Justin?
Yeah.
I need it.
Want the slides.
I need it.
We need it.
Absolutely.
And this has been recorded, and so we will also be able to share this out. I'm going to leave the room open just because this is also our last call with this particular group. So if there's anyone you want to stay in touch with, you can send them a DM if you want to get their email or something. I'll leave this open. But just want to say thank you all so much for your participation today and the months prior. The group wouldn't be what it is without all of you and your contributions, recommendations. And so thank you so much. It's been such a joy working with you all. And I know we'll continue working together in different ways. But if you have any questions about staying in touch with GIA or staying in touch with the Support for Individual Artists Committee, just reach out to me and we'll figure something out. And I just want to say thank you again. And so I'll kick it over to Celeste and C to share some final notes as well.
I just want to say, again, thank you for such a rich conversation, Justin. It feels like I'm really full with all of these ideas. And we did have, it went by really quickly this time together. I feel like I could hang out here for another hour and still have more questions and more thoughts. So thank you for that. I just want to say to the Hive that it's been wonderful working with you, and I'm glad that you were able to join us for this conversation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Celeste.
Basically what C said, it's been a pleasure building with everyone. And, Justin, as I listened to you, just reminded of the time in the conversations we've had. And, every time I see you, I miss you more. So really appreciative of you coming through and sharing time and space with us, and, keep building.
Absolutely, yeah. My thanks to everyone too. I'm of course learning in the conversation with you all, and I'm grateful for it.